The summer sun beat down on Fort Knox, Kentucky, turning the tank training grounds into a shimmering sea of heat and dust. It was June 1944, and the war in Europe was raging. Every day, new recruits arrived to learn the deadly art of tank warfare before shipping out to fight the Germans. Among the latest group of trainees stood someone who made every head turn. Her name was Margaret "Maggie" Sullivan, and she was the only woman in a company of 200 men. Maggie stood at attention in her crisp uniform, her auburn hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun. At 24 years old, she had already proven herself as a mechanic in a defense plant back in Detroit. She could take apart an engine and put it back together faster than most men twice her age. But none of that seemed to matter here. Well, what do we have here? Sergeant Buck Morrison walked slowly around Maggie, his boots crunching in the gravel. He was a thick-necked man with a permanent scowl and a voice like grinding gears. "Boys, it seems the Army has sent us a secretary by mistake." Laughter rippled through the ranks. Maggie kept her eyes forward, her jaw tight. "I'm here to train on the Sherman tank, Sergeant," she said firmly. "Same as everyone else." Morrison stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Is that right? You think you can handle a 30-ton killing machine? You think you can load shells while German rounds are bouncing off your hull?" "I know I can, Sergeant." More laughter. One voice called out from the back. "Maybe she can dust the tank after we're done with it." Morrison held up his hand and the laughter died. "Listen here, Miss Sullivan, I don't care what strings you pulled or what politician's daughter you are. This isn't a game. The Sherman tank is what we've got, and it's what our boys are dying in right now across the ocean. Some fancy-pants officers call it a death trap compared to the German Panther. And you know what? They might be right. But it's all we've got, and I'll be damned if I let someone who can't cut it waste my time and a valuable machine." Maggie felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "With respect, Sergeant, I didn't pull any strings. I volunteered. My brother died in a Sherman at Kasserine Pass. My father died building them in the factory. This isn't about politics for me, it's personal." For a moment, something flickered in Morrison's eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Personal don't mean squat in war. It means you'll make mistakes, get emotional, get people killed." He turned to address the whole company. "Everyone here will train on the M4 Sherman. You'll learn every inch of her. You'll learn her strengths and her weaknesses, and if you survive training, maybe some of you will survive combat." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Maggie's life. Every morning began before dawn with a 5-mile run. Then came classroom instruction on tank mechanics, ammunition types, enemy armor capabilities, and battlefield tactics. In the afternoons, they worked on the tanks themselves. The Sherman was smaller than Maggie had imagined. Inside, it was cramped and hot and smelled of oil and metal. There were 5 crew positions: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, who also operated the hull machine gun. Maggie was assigned to train as a loader, responsible for feeding 75mm shells into the main gun as fast as possible under combat conditions. "The German Panther," their instructor, Lieutenant Barnes, explained one afternoon, "has thicker armor than our Sherman. Its gun can punch through our front plate at over a mile away, but our gun can barely scratch their front armor at half that distance." A hand went up. "So why don't we just build better tanks, sir?" Barnes smiled sadly. "Good question, Private. The answer is complicated. We can build 5 Shermans in the time it takes the Germans to build 1 Panther. We can ship them anywhere because they're lighter and more reliable. They run on gasoline, which we have plenty of. Panthers run on fuel we'd have to capture from the enemy. And here's the big one: Shermans are easy to fix. A good crew can swap out an engine in the field. Panthers break down constantly, and when they do, they usually stay broken." "But men still die in them," someone muttered. "Yes, they do," Barnes said quietly. "Men die in every tank. War is about choosing which bad option is less bad than the others." During live-fire exercises, Maggie proved herself again and again. Her hands were quick and sure. She could load a shell, close the breech, and have the next round ready in seconds. But no matter how well she performed, the mockery continued. In the mess hall, men would fall silent when she approached, then start whispering as soon as she sat down. During breaks, she'd find her gear moved or hidden. Once, someone put motor oil in her canteen. She dumped it out, refilled the canteen, and said nothing. The worst was Corporal Danny Briggs. He was a loud, cocky kid from Texas who never missed a chance to make Maggie's life difficult. During training exercises, he'd accidentally slam into her. He'd question her every move, suggesting she was too weak or too slow or too confused. "My grandmother could load faster than that," he'd sneer, "and she's been dead 5 years." Maggie learned to ignore him. She focused on the work. Every free moment, she studied tank manuals and combat reports from North Africa and Sicily. She memorized the thickness of German armor at different angles. She learned the silhouettes of enemy tanks so she could identify them at a glance. Late one night, she was in the motor pool, studying the suspension system of a Sherman by flashlight, when she heard footsteps. She turned to find Lieutenant Barnes watching her. "Shouldn't you be sleeping, Sullivan?" "Couldn't sleep, sir. Wanted to understand the vertical volute spring suspension system better. I read that it's one reason the Sherman is more reliable than the Panther's torsion bar system, but I wanted to see it for myself." Barnes stepped closer, examining the suspension. "You're right, it's simpler, cheaper, and easier to fix. The Germans over-engineer everything, makes for impressive machines, but in a war, simple and reliable beats complicated and powerful." He paused. "You're doing well in training." "Thank you, sir." "I mean it, top marks in your class. Faster load times than anyone, you know your stuff." He looked at her seriously. "But you need to understand something. Even if you finish first in this program, even if you're the best trainee we've ever seen, they're never going to send you overseas. Women aren't allowed in combat roles. That's the regulation." Maggie had known this, but hearing it said aloud felt like a punch to the gut. "Then why am I here, sir?" "Because the Army needs good instructors stateside. They need people who understand these machines inside and out to train the men who will fight. It's not the glory you might have wanted, but it's important work." He turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, Sullivan, if things were different, I'd be proud to have you in my tank." After he left, Maggie sat in the darkness next to the Sherman, running her hand along its cold metal skin. She thought about her brother Tommy, barely 19 when he died. She thought about the letters he'd sent home, talking about his Sherman with a strange mixture of affection and fear. He'd named it Lucky Lady and had written that it was the only home he had over there. She made a promise to Tommy's memory that night. If she couldn't fight, she'd make sure every man who did fight knew everything she could teach them. She'd make them understand that the Sherman wasn't a death trap. It was a tool, and in the right hands with the right knowledge, it could keep them alive. The next morning, Sergeant Morrison announced that final evaluations would begin in 1 week. The top performers would graduate to advanced training. The rest would be reassigned. Maggie intended to be at the very top. The evaluation course was a monster. It combined everything they'd learned: navigation across rough terrain, target identification, live fire accuracy, and emergency procedures. Each trainee would run the course with a full crew, and every member's performance would be graded individually. Maggie was assigned to a crew with 4 men she barely knew. The commander was a quiet sergeant from Iowa named Anderson. The gunner was a sharp-eyed corporal named Mitchell. The driver was Private First Class Lopez, who spoke with a thick accent and had the quickest reflexes Maggie had ever seen. And the assistant driver was Danny Briggs. Of course it was Briggs. "Well, ain't this just perfect?" Briggs said when the assignments were posted. "Stuck with a girl playing soldier. We'll be lucky if she doesn't faint the first time we fire the gun." Anderson stepped between them. "That's enough, Corporal. Sullivan's load times are faster than yours. I've seen the records. You're the one who better not slow us down." Briggs's face turned red, but he said nothing more. The night before the evaluation, Maggie couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, going over every procedure in her mind. Load, close breach, tap commander's leg, move to next shell. If the gun jammed, clear it in 12 seconds. If they took a hit, check for fire first, then casualties. The Sherman's biggest weakness was that it caught fire easily when penetrated. Crews called it brewing up. The gasoline engine and ammunition storage made it a rolling bomb if you didn't know what you were doing. But Maggie also knew the Sherman's strengths. It was fast, maneuvering at speeds the heavier Panther couldn't match. Its gyroscopic stabilizer let them fire accurately while moving, something German tanks couldn't do. And the crew could escape quickly through multiple hatches if things went bad. In the Panther, with its heavy, complicated design, crews often got trapped. At dawn, the 5 of them climbed into their assigned Sherman. The inside was exactly as cramped as Maggie remembered, maybe worse with all of them in full gear. She took her position next to the main gun, surrounded by the stored ammunition. Each shell was heavy, awkward, and potentially deadly if mishandled. Anderson's voice came through the intercom. "Radio check, everyone sound off." One by one, they confirmed their positions. Then Lopez fired up the engine and the Sherman roared to life. The whole machine vibrated with power. Despite everything, despite the mockery and the doubt and the knowledge that she'd never see real combat, Maggie felt a thrill run through her. "All right, crew," Anderson said. "Remember, we're being graded on everything: speed, accuracy, communication, and adaptability. The course is 2 hours long. We've got targets to find and hit, obstacles to navigate, and they'll throw surprises at us. Stay sharp." The Sherman lurched forward. Through the periscope, Maggie could see the course ahead, a winding path through hills, trees, and mock buildings that represented a European village. Somewhere out there were enemy tank targets, infantry positions, and hidden threats. They'd been moving for only 5 minutes when the first challenge hit. A smoke canister exploded ahead of them, filling the path with thick white clouds. "Driver, halt," Anderson commanded. "Sullivan, Mitchell, watch for targets. They'll use the smoke to hide something." Maggie pressed her eye to her periscope, scanning. There, a gray shape in the smoke, partially hidden behind a building. "Target 10 o'clock, 200 yards, hull down position," she called out. "Identified," Mitchell said. "Looks like a Panther target." "Load armor-piercing," Anderson ordered. Maggie grabbed an AP shell, hefting its weight smoothly. In one practiced motion, she slid it into the breech and slammed it closed. "Up," she called, slapping Anderson's leg to signal the gun was ready. "Fire." The cannon roared. The concussion inside the tank was tremendous, even with their headsets. Smoke and cordite fumes filled the compartment. Through the clearing smoke outside, Maggie saw the target's hit marker light up red. "Hit," Mitchell confirmed. "Good shooting," Anderson said. "Load he, we're moving into the village. Expect infantry." They pushed through the course, encountering one challenge after another. A mock anti-tank gun position, a simulated ambush from the flank, a bridge that Lopez had to navigate with only inches to spare on either side. Through it all, Maggie kept her focus on her job. Load, signal, reload. Her arms ached from the weight of the shells, but her movements never slowed. Then they reached the final challenge. 3 target tanks appeared simultaneously, positioned to simulate a perfect German ambush. 1 to the front, 2 on the flanks. The instructors had positioned them so the crew would have to choose their targets carefully and move quickly. "Contact front," Anderson's voice was sharp. "Contact left, contact right, driver, reverse, give us an angle." Lopez threw the Sherman into reverse. The tank lurched backward, its engine screaming. Mitchell traversed the turret left. "Load AP," Anderson ordered. Maggie already had the shell moving. She slammed it home. "Up." "Fire." Hit, the left target lit up. "Load, contact right." Maggie's hands flew. Another shell into the breech, closed, signal. "Up." "Fire." Hit, 2 down. "Load, contact front." But as Maggie reached for the third shell, something went wrong. Her boot caught on a shell casing and she stumbled. The shell slipped from her hands, falling toward the turret floor. If it hit hard enough, if the primer struck wrong. Time seemed to slow. Maggie twisted, catching the shell against her body before it could fall. Pain shot through her ribs where the metal struck, but she had it. She straightened, loaded the shell, and slammed the breech closed. "Up." "Fire." The third target exploded in red. Course complete. As the Sherman rolled to a stop at the finish line, Maggie realized her hands were shaking. She looked down and saw blood on her uniform. The shell had torn through her jacket and cut her side when she'd caught it. Anderson's voice came through the intercom. "Outstanding work, everyone. Sullivan, you okay back there?" Saw that save on the camera. "I'm fine, sir," Maggie said, though the pain in her ribs was sharp and hot. When they climbed out, Lieutenant Barnes was waiting with a clipboard and a stern expression. But as he looked at the blood on Maggie's uniform, his expression changed. "Sullivan, you need medical attention." "It's just a scratch, sir." "That's an order, not a suggestion." He turned to Anderson. "Sergeant, your crew just posted the fastest time we've seen all month. And Sullivan, that recovery on the dropped shell saved not just time, but potentially your whole crew. In combat, that shell could have cooked off and killed everyone. Quick thinking." Briggs, who had been silent since they finished, finally spoke up. "She dropped it in the first place. Clumsy." Barnes' eyes went cold. "Corporal Briggs, according to my notes, you missed 2 radio checks and failed to identify an infantry target that was directly in front of your position." Sullivan's one mistake was more than compensated by her recovery. Yours weren't. Dismissed. At the infirmary, the medic cleaned and bandaged Maggie's cut. It was deep but not serious. She'd have a scar, but she'd had worse from factory work. That evening, the trainees gathered for the announcement of the evaluation results. Sergeant Morrison stood on a platform, his face unreadable. "I've been training tank crews for 3 years," he began. "I've seen hundreds of men come through this program. Some wash out, some barely pass, and a very few, show that they have what it takes to be real tank soldiers." He pulled out a paper. "The following individuals scored in the top 10% and are hereby recommended for advanced instruction and potential combat assignment." He read off 9 names. Maggie held her breath, but she wasn't among them. Morrison paused, then looked directly at her. "And one individual, despite not being eligible for combat assignment due to regulations, performed at a level that deserves recognition. Sullivan, front and center." Maggie walked forward on shaky legs. The crowd was silent. "Sullivan's technical knowledge, load times, and performance under pressure exceed any trainee I've evaluated this year. Male or female, she's the best loader I've seen. Therefore, I'm assigning her to our permanent instructor cadre, effective immediately. She'll train every loader that comes through this facility from now on." It wasn't combat. It wasn't what she'd dreamed. But as applause broke out, genuine and loud, Maggie realized something. She'd proven herself, not to everyone maybe, but to the ones who mattered. After the ceremony, Anderson approached her. "Sullivan, I meant what I said in that tank. You're a good soldier. If they ever let women fight, I'd want you in my crew." Mitchell and Lopez echoed the sentiment. Even Briggs, though he said nothing, gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Only Sergeant Morrison hung back, but as Maggie was leaving, he called her name. "Sullivan." She turned. "Yes, Sergeant." "Your brother, Tommy Sullivan, Kasserine Pass." "Yes, Sergeant." Morrison's face softened in a way she'd never seen. "I was there. Different unit, but I was there. It was a mess. We were green, our tactics were wrong, and we faced Panthers and Tigers we weren't ready for. A lot of good men died learning lessons we should have already known." He paused, his voice rough. "Your brother Sherman took 3 hits covering a retreat. He could have bilayed out after the first one, but he stayed on that gun until the rest of his unit got clear. He saved maybe 20 lives. I never knew his loader was his sister." Tears burned in Maggie's eyes. "I didn't know the details. They just said he was killed in action." "He was a hero, and from what I've seen, it runs in the family." Morrison extended his hand. "I'm sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong." Maggie shook his hand, unable to speak. That night, lying in her bunk, Maggie thought about Tommy, about the Sherman tank and why American tankers chose it despite its flaws. She was beginning to understand. It wasn't about having the best tank. It was about having a tank you could trust, that you could fix, that you could learn to use well. The Sherman gave you a fighting chance if you knew what you were doing. And now it was her job to make sure every crew that came through Fort Knox knew exactly what they were doing. Over the following months, Maggie transformed from student to teacher. She discovered that she had a gift for instruction, a way of explaining complex mechanical concepts in simple terms that men could grasp quickly. More importantly, she could share the hard-won wisdom of combat veterans in a way that made it stick. "The Sherman isn't a death trap," she'd tell each new class. "But it will kill you if you're stupid or lazy or think you already know everything. The Germans have better armor and bigger guns, that's a fact. So we compensate with speed, reliability, and numbers. You want to survive? Learn these 3 rules." She'd hold up one finger. "First, never stop moving. A moving target is harder to hit, and the Sherman can move faster than a Panther. Use that." A second finger. "Second, shoot first. Our stabilizer means we can fire accurately on the move. The Germans have to stop to shoot. That's your advantage. Use it." A third finger. "Third, know your enemy. A Panther's front armor is nearly impenetrable to our gun, but its side armor is weaker. Its engine deck is vulnerable. Get an angle on it and you've got a chance. Come at it head-on like a fool and you're dead." The men listened. Word spread that Sullivan's classes were the ones you didn't skip. She was tough but fair, demanding but patient. She knew every inch of the Sherman and could explain not just what to do but why it mattered. But not everyone appreciated her new position. Captain Harold Westfield arrived at Fort Knox in September 1944. He was a West Point graduate with a family military lineage going back to the Revolutionary War. He was also, Maggie quickly learned, deeply opposed to women in any military role beyond nursing or administration. "This is absurd," he said during his first meeting with the instruction staff, his cold eyes fixed on Maggie. "We have qualified male instructors sitting idle while we let a woman teach men how to fight. It's a mockery of military tradition." Lieutenant Barnes, who had been promoted to captain himself, spoke up. "Sir, Specialist Sullivan has the highest student satisfaction ratings of any instructor. Her students consistently perform better in evaluations." "I don't care if her students tap dance better," Westfield snapped. "It's inappropriate. Men need male role models in combat training, not some factory girl playing soldier." Maggie kept her face neutral, but inside she was seething. Factory girl. As if the work she'd done building these very tanks was somehow lesser than wearing a uniform. "With respect, sir," she said carefully, "my students seem to respond to knowledge and competence, not gender. The Sherman doesn't care who understands it as long as someone does." Westfield's face reddened. "Did I ask for your opinion, Specialist?" "No, sir." "Then keep your mouth shut. I'm reassigning you to motor pool maintenance. We'll bring in a proper instructor for your classes." Barnes stood. "Sir, I need to formally object to this decision. Specialist Sullivan is." "Your objection is noted and overruled, Captain. Dismissed." Maggie spent the next 2 weeks in the motor pool doing routine maintenance on training vehicles. It was mindless work that didn't challenge her. She watched from a distance as a new instructor, Sergeant Paul Crawford, took over her classes. Crawford was competent enough, but he lacked combat experience. He taught by the book, without the deeper understanding that came from studying actual battle reports and talking to veterans. Maggie could see the students becoming frustrated, their questions going unanswered in any meaningful way. Then came a cold October morning when everything changed. A telegram arrived at Fort Knox marked urgent. Captain Barnes read it in the officers' mess, and his face went pale. He immediately called an emergency meeting of all senior staff. Maggie heard about it from Lopez, who now worked as a clerk in the admin office. "Something big happened in Europe," he told her quietly. "Real bad. They're not saying what, but I saw Barnes. He looked like he'd seen a ghost." The next day, Barnes found Maggie in the motor pool. "Sullivan, walk with me." They moved away from the other soldiers, toward the edge of the base, where the tank training grounds stretched into the distance. Several Shermans sat idle in the morning sun. "I'm going to tell you something that isn't public yet," Barnes said. "In a few days, everyone will know, but I need you to hear it first because it's going to affect you directly." Maggie's stomach tightened. "What happened?" "There was a battle in France, a place called Aracourt. Our 4th Armored Division, equipped with Shermans, engaged a German force that included over 200 Panther tanks." Maggie knew enough about tactics to understand the implication. On paper, that should have been a massacre of American forces. The Panther was supposedly superior in every way. "We won," Barnes said quietly. "Destroyed or disabled over 100 German tanks, including most of those Panthers. We lost 25 Shermans. But more importantly, our crews figured out how to fight the Panthers effectively. They used speed, maneuverability, and combined arms tactics. Everything you've been teaching." "That's wonderful news," Maggie said, confused about why Barnes looked so grim. "It is, but the reports from the battlefield also highlighted something else. Crews that had been trained in the old methods, the by-the-book approaches, took heavier casualties. They tried to fight the Panthers head-on, tank against tank, best armor against best armor. They got slaughtered. The crews that survived were the ones who understood their equipment, who knew the Sherman's strengths and weaknesses, who fought smart instead of proud." Understanding dawned. Captain Westfield's approach. "Exactly. The Army is now reviewing all training protocols. They want to identify which methods produce the best combat outcomes and make those the standard." Barnes looked at her. "Your students, the ones you trained before Westfield reassigned you, are being tracked. Their performance in advanced training is being compared to others. And Sullivan, they're excelling." "I'm glad," Maggie said, meaning it. "There's more. The review board is coming here next week. They're going to observe all our instructors and make recommendations. This is a chance to prove that your methods work, that you should be teaching again." He paused. "But there's a problem. Captain Westfield, he's already preparing to present Crawford as our model instructor. He's going to bury any evidence that your approach is better. He has friends on the review board. If he gets his way, not only will you stay in the motor pool, but your teaching methods will be discredited. Maggie felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced it down. What do you need from me? Barnes smiled slightly. I need you to do what you do best, teach. I'm authorizing you to run a special class for a group of fresh recruits. The review board will observe both Crawford's class and yours. Let your results speak for themselves. Westfield will never allow it. Westfield is going to be conveniently called away to division headquarters for a meeting that day. By the time he gets back, the observation will be complete. Barnes' smile widened. Funny how these scheduling conflicts happen. The next week was a blur of preparation. Maggie worked with a group of 20 new recruits who had arrived just days earlier. They knew nothing about tanks, which made them perfect subjects. She could start from scratch, teaching them her way. She began with respect for the machine. This Sherman tank kept your brothers and fathers alive in North Africa and Italy. It's keeping them alive right now in France. It's not perfect, but it's ours, and it's good. Anyone who tells you it's a death trap doesn't understand the first thing about armored warfare. She taught them the mechanics, yes, but also the psychology. The Germans want you to be afraid of their Panthers and Tigers. They want you to think you're outmatched before the fight even starts. But fear makes you hesitate, and hesitation kills you. Respect the enemy's capabilities, but never fear them. She showed them battle footage, crude films shot by combat cameramen. Watch this Sherman. See how it doesn't try to trade shots with that Panther? It moves laterally, forces the Panther to traverse its turret. While the Panther is turning, the Sherman hits it in the side. That's not luck. That's training and intelligence. The recruits were eager, asking questions, staying late to practice loading drills and target identification. Maggie could see the confidence building in them, the understanding that they weren't being sent to die in inferior equipment, but being given tools they could use to win. The day of the review board observation arrived. 5 senior officers, including a colonel from the Armored Forces School, sat in the observation tower overlooking the training grounds. Captain Westfield had indeed been called away, though Maggie suspected he'd recharged his trip as soon as he could. Crawford taught first. His class was technically sound but uninspired. He lectured about armor thickness and gun penetration statistics. He had the men run standard drills. Everything was by the book and perfectly adequate. Then it was Maggie's turn. She started with a question, "Why are we here?" The recruits looked confused. One raised his hand. "To learn about the Sherman tank, ma'am." "Wrong," Maggie said. "We're here to learn how to keep you alive and win battles. The Sherman is just a tool to do that. Now, who can tell me the Sherman's biggest weakness?" "The armor, ma'am. It's thinner than a Panther's." "True, but that's not the biggest weakness. Anyone else?" A young private from Louisiana spoke up hesitantly. "Is it? Us, ma'am, the crew." Maggie smiled. "Exactly right, Private. The biggest weakness of any tank is a crew that doesn't know how to use it. The Sherman will do everything you ask of it, but you have to ask the right things. Come on, let's get in the tanks." For the next 2 hours, she put them through scenarios. Not scripted drills, but problems they'd actually face. Ambushes, mechanical failures, communication breakdowns. She made them think, adapt, and work together. At one point, she stopped a drill and gathered everyone around a Sherman. "This tank right here is often called a death trap. You know why? Because some crews panic when they take a hit. They forget their training and try to bail out through the wrong hatches or in the wrong order. They get jammed up, and if there's a fire, they don't make it." She climbed onto the tank. "But if you train properly, if you know your escape routes and practice them until they're automatic, you can evacuate this tank in under 10 seconds. I'm going to prove it. Mitchell, fire a smoke charge to simulate a hit." Mitchell, who had volunteered to help with the demonstration, fired a smoke grenade inside the tank. Thick gray smoke poured from the hatches. "Time me," Maggie said, and dropped into the tank. The recruits counted. At 8 seconds, she emerged from the driver's hatch, having navigated through the smoke-filled interior and out a different exit than she'd entered. "That's with smoke and full gear," she said, climbing down. "Practice it until you can do it blindfolded and faster than me. That's how you survive." The observation ended. The review board filed out of the tower without comment. Maggie had no idea if she'd done enough. That night, unable to sleep, she walked out to the tank training grounds. The moon was bright, casting long shadows from the rows of Shermans. She climbed onto one and sat on the turret, looking up at the stars. "You'd be proud, Tommy," she whispered. "I think I'm finally making a difference." "You are." She jumped. Captain Barnes was walking toward her across the grounds. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you," he said. "Mind if I join you?" She moved over, and he climbed up to sit beside her. "The review board finished deliberations an hour ago," he said. Maggie's heart raced, and they're recommending your training methods be adopted across all armored forces training facilities. Not just here, but every base that trains Sherman crews. They want you to develop a training manual and potentially tour other bases to train instructors. Maggie couldn't breathe. Really? Really, the colonel said, and I quote, "That woman understands armored warfare better than half the officers I know. If we'd had instructors like her from the beginning, we'd have lost fewer men at Kasserine." Tears spilled down Maggie's cheeks before she could stop them. Barnes pretended not to notice, looking up at the stars. "There's one more thing," he said. "Westfield tried to block the recommendation, said it was inappropriate. The colonel told him that winning the war was more important than his outdated notions of propriety, and that if he couldn't accept that, perhaps a different assignment would be more suitable." "What happened to Westfield?" "He's being transferred to a logistics position stateside. He won't be involved in combat training anymore." Barnes stood. "Get some rest, Sullivan. You've got a lot of work ahead of you." As he walked away, Maggie sat alone on the Sherman, feeling the cool metal beneath her, solid and real. She thought about all the men she'd trained, all the ones she would train. Somewhere in Europe, in France or Belgium or Germany itself, men were climbing into Shermans right now, preparing to face Panthers and Tigers and all the terrors of war. But they weren't going in unprepared. They knew their machines, they knew the tactics, and some of them just maybe would survive because of what she'd taught them. It wasn't the glory of combat, but it mattered just as much. Part 4, Letters from the Front. Winter came to Fort Knox, bringing cold winds and gray skis. The war in Europe ground on through Belgium and into Germany itself. Every day brought news of battles won and lost, ground gained and paid for in blood. And every week, letters arrived for Maggie. The first one came in November, just after Thanksgiving. The return address showed only a military postal code, but inside was a handwritten note on Army stationery. "Dear Specialist Sullivan, you don't know me, but I was in your training class last spring. I'm writing to thank you. 2 days ago, my crew encountered 3 Panthers outside a town called Metz. We remembered what you taught us about speed and angles. We didn't panic. We maneuvered and got our shots off first. All 3 Panthers were disabled. My entire crew survived without a scratch. I'm alive because of you. Thank you seems inadequate, but it's all I have." Signed, Corporal James Mitchell, 4th Armored Division. Maggie read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. She pinned it to the wall of her small office in the training building. More letters followed. Some were jubilant, describing successful engagements and survived battles. Others were somber, written by soldiers who had lost crew members but wanted her to know that her training had given them a fighting chance. A few were from the families of men who had died, thanking her for the time she'd given them with their sons or husbands or brothers. She answered every single letter. Late into the night, by lamplight, she wrote back with encouragement, advice, and gratitude for their service. The stack of letters grew, covering one wall and then another. Each one represented a life touched, a soldier who had passed through her classroom. But not all the news was good. In December, during the chaos of the German offensive in the Ardennes that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, American forces took heavy casualties. The Germans threw everything they had into the attack, including their newest and heaviest tanks. One evening, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, who had been promoted again, came to Maggie's office. His face was gray with exhaustion. "Sullivan, I need you to see something." He handed her a report from the front. It detailed a battle in which an American tank company had been overrun. Most of the crews had been killed or captured. The report noted that the unit had been trained using what it called traditional methods and had attempted to fight the German armor in a head-on engagement. 23 tanks lost, Barnes said quietly. Over 100 men dead or missing. And here's the thing that's killing me. We could have prevented it. If they'd been trained your way, if they'd understood the Sherman's capabilities instead of trying to fight like they had tigers of their own, most of them would still be alive. Maggie set down the report with shaking hands. We can't save everyone. No, but we could have saved them. And there are still units out there, Sullivan, using the old methods because the training rollout isn't complete. Men are dying because we're not moving fast enough. That night, Maggie wrote a letter to the Armored Forces School headquarters. She proposed a radical idea, an intensive instructor training program that could be completed in 2 weeks instead of 2 months. It would focus exclusively on the tactical and practical knowledge that saved lives, cutting out the bureaucratic and ceremonial aspects that slowed everything down. She expected the proposal to be rejected or, at best, to disappear into the vast military bureaucracy. Instead, she received orders to report to Fort Benning, Georgia, to run the first accelerated instructor course herself. She left Fort Knox in January 1945, as snow fell on the tank training grounds she'd come to think of as home. The journey south felt strange, almost dreamlike. She was no longer the mocked recruit or the unproven specialist. She was now Warrant Officer Sullivan, authorized to train officers and senior NCOs in the methods of armored warfare instruction. Fort Benning was twice the size of Knox, bustling with activity. The war was entering its final phase, everyone could feel it, but that made the training even more urgent. Every tank crew sent to Europe now might face the war's last and most desperate battles. The first instructor course had 40 students, all men, ranging from lieutenants to majors. Some were veterans being pulled back for training duty. Others were experienced instructors who had been using the old methods and were being retrained. And standing in the front row, arms crossed and expression skeptical, was Captain Harold Westfield. Maggie felt her stomach drop. She'd heard he'd been transferred to logistics, but apparently someone had decided he needed to go through the new instructor training anyway. From the look on his face, he wasn't happy about it. "Gentlemen," Maggie began, pushing down her nervousness, "welcome to accelerated instructor training. Over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to teach you how to teach others to survive in a Sherman tank. This isn't about making soldiers feel good or boosting morale. This is about giving men the knowledge they need to come home alive." She launched into the curriculum, moving fast, packing each day with information and practical exercises. The students worked dawn to dusk, learning not just what to teach, but how to teach it in a way that would stick under pressure. Most of the men adapted quickly. They could see the value in the methods and threw themselves into the work. But Westfield was a constant thorn. He questioned everything, challenged her authority, and made snide comments about unconventional approaches. One afternoon, during a practical exercise, he finally pushed too far. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly, stopping the entire class. "We're teaching men to run away from superior enemy tanks. Where's the American fighting spirit? Where's the courage to stand and fight?" The class went silent, all eyes turned to Maggie. She walked slowly across the training ground until she stood directly in front of Westfield. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried clearly to everyone present. "Captain Westfield, do you know how many tank crew members die because of fighting spirit?" "I don't deal in." "Hundreds," she cut him off. "Hundreds of men dead because they thought courage meant charging straight at a Panther's front armor. Hundreds of widows and orphans created because someone told their husbands and fathers that running from a bad tactical position was cowardice." She pointed to the Sherman behind her. "This tank is not about pride. It's not about proving American superiority. It's a tool designed to accomplish a mission while keeping its crew alive. Teaching men to use it intelligently, to choose their battles, to survive so they can fight again tomorrow, that's not cowardice. That's professional soldiering." Westfield's face reddened. "You're teaching defeatism." "I'm teaching victory. Do you know what happened at Iraq? We killed 5 Panthers for every Sherman we lost. Do you know why? Because our crews were smarter, faster, and better trained. Not because they were braver. The Germans are brave too, but we won because we fought smart." She pulled a letter from her pocket, one of the dozens she'd received. "This is from a sergeant whose crew encountered a King Tiger, the biggest, baddest tank the Germans have. 68 tons, armor so thick our gun can barely scratch it. By your logic, he should have charged it head-on to show fighting spirit. Instead, he remembered his training. He broke contact, maneuvered around, called in artillery, and let them deal with it while he engaged softer targets. His crew survived. They completed their mission. They lived to fight another day. That's not cowardice, Captain, that's leadership." The training ground was absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Finally, a major in the back row spoke up. The warrant officer is right. I was at Kasserine Pass in '43. I saw good men die because we didn't know what the hell we were doing. We tried to fight the Germans on their terms with their tactics. It was a slaughter if we'd had this training then. He shook his head. We'd have lost fewer friends. Other voices chimed in, veterans nodding and adding their own experiences. Westfield looked around and seemed to realize he was alone in his position. Dismissed for today, Maggie said. Tomorrow we continue with gun-laying techniques under pressure. That evening, she was reviewing training materials in her temporary office when someone knocked. She looked up to see Westfield in the doorway. "May I come in?" She nodded, wary. Westfield closed the door and stood awkwardly for a moment. "I owe you an apology." Maggie said nothing, waiting. "I've spent my entire career believing in a certain way of doing things. Military tradition, proper roles, chain of command. When you came along, challenging those beliefs, I felt threatened. I convinced myself you were the problem." He looked at her directly. "But I was wrong. I let my pride and my prejudices blind me to the truth. You're not just a good instructor, you're an exceptional one, and men are alive right now because of what you taught them." "Thank you," Maggie said carefully. "I want you to know that I've written letters to my colleagues on the review boards and at other training facilities. I've told them that your methods should be the standard and that I was wrong to oppose them." He moved toward the door, then paused. "My nephew is over there in France. He's a tank commander. I got a letter from him last week. He mentioned that his crew had survived several engagements because their loader had trained here at Knox with someone named Sullivan. He said that loader knew things that kept them alive." Westfield's voice cracked slightly. "That's my nephew's life you saved, warrant officer. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but it's all I have." After he left, Maggie sat in the quiet office, surrounded by her letters and training manuals. She thought about all the threads that connected her to soldiers across the ocean. Men she'd never met whose lives intersected with hers through shared knowledge, passed from teacher to student to friend to crew member. The war would end eventually. Everyone could feel it now. Germany was being squeezed from east and west, their armies retreating, their cities burning. But until that final day, until the last shot was fired, men would still climb into Sherman tanks and face enemy armor. And because of her, more of them would climb back out alive. The 2 weeks of instructor training passed quickly. The students graduated and scattered to training bases across the country, carrying the new methods with them. Maggie received orders to return to Fort Knox, where she would continue developing curriculum and training materials. But before she left Fort Benning, one more letter arrived. This one was different. The handwriting was shaky, and there were water stains on the paper. "Dear Warrant Officer Sullivan, you don't know me, but you knew my brother Danny Briggs. I'm writing from a hospital in England. Danny was wounded 3 weeks ago in Germany. A shell hit his Sherman and killed the commander and driver. Danny, who was the assistant driver, pulled the injured loader out of the burning tank. He saved that man's life, but got burned pretty badly himself. He's going to survive, but his war is over. Before they put him under for surgery, he asked me to write to you. He said to tell you that he was sorry for how he treated you during training. He said you were right about everything and that he was a stupid kid who didn't know what he didn't know. He said the things you taught them saved his life and his crew's lives more than once. He's proud to have trained with you. Signed, Corporal Martin Briggs." Maggie folded the letter carefully and added it to her collection. Danny Briggs, the cocky kid from Texas who'd made her life miserable. He'd survived, grown up, and become a real soldier. She wrote back immediately, wishing him a full recovery and thanking him for his service. She meant every word. Spring came early to Kentucky in 1945. The trees around Fort Knox burst into green life and the winter mud dried into workable ground. The war news was increasingly optimistic. The Rhine had been crossed. Berlin was surrounded. Everyone knew the end was close. But the Pacific War still raged, and plans were already underway to shift forces from Europe to the invasion of Japan. New crews needed training, and the Sherman would be part of that fight too. Maggie threw herself into the work with renewed energy. She'd been promoted to chief warrant officer and given responsibility for all tank gunnery instruction at Knox. Her days were filled with classes, demonstrations, and endless paperwork. The letters from Europe kept coming, though their tone was changing. Instead of desperate thanks for survival, they were becoming reflective, looking toward the future. One letter in particular moved her deeply. It came from Sergeant Anderson, her old crew commander from training evaluations. Dear Chief Sullivan, I'm writing from somewhere in Germany. Can't say where exactly, but we're rolling through towns that barely exist anymore. The Germans are done, everyone can see it. We've been in combat for 8 months now, and I wanted you to know that everything you taught us proved true. Our crew has faced panthers, tigers, and even one of those monster king tigers. We've been hit twice and survived both times because we knew how to evacuate quickly and work together. Our Sherman isn't a death trap. It's been our lucky charm, our home, and our weapon all rolled into one. We named her Maggie's Pride. Hope you don't mind. When this is over, I'm coming back to Knox. I want to help train the next generation, pass on what we learned the hard way. We need more instructors like you who tell the truth and don't sugarcoat reality. Thank you for everything. Yours, Sergeant Tom Anderson, 3rd Armored Division. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Fort Knox erupted in celebration. Men cheered, jeeps honked their horns, and someone fired off a flare that lit up the evening sky. Maggie joined the celebration, smiling and shaking hands, but part of her mind was already thinking ahead. The Pacific, Japan. The invasion that everyone knew was coming would be the bloodiest yet, and Sherman tanks would be part of it, fighting in terrain and conditions completely different from Europe. But 3 months later, in August, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war was truly over. The transition to peace was chaotic. Men who'd been preparing to ship out to the Pacific were suddenly going home instead. Training classes were canceled or reduced. The massive machinery of war began to wind down. Maggie expected to be reassigned or discharged. Women who'd taken military roles during the war were being sent back to civilian life in droves. But instead, she received a summons to a meeting at Armored Forces headquarters. She arrived at the imposing building on a humid September morning, nervous and uncertain. A secretary led her to a conference room where several high-ranking officers waited, including a brigadier general she didn't recognize. "Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan," the general said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit. I'm General Marcus Wheeler. I've wanted to meet you for some time." Maggie sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "The war is over," Wheeler continued, "and that means we have some decisions to make about the future of our armored forces. We're going to be much smaller than we were. Many good soldiers will return to civilian life. But we need to keep our best people, the ones who can help us build a professional, peacetime army that's ready if the world needs us again." He pulled out a folder. "I've been reviewing training outcomes from every armored forces school in the country. Do you know what I found? Units trained using your methods had consistently better combat performance, better survival rates, better mission completion, better everything." Another officer, a colonel, spoke up. "We tracked over 500 tank crews that received training directly or indirectly from your curriculum. Their casualty rate was 40% lower than crews trained with traditional methods. 40%. That's not a coincidence or luck. That's the result of superior training." Wheeler leaned forward. "Chief Sullivan, we want you to stay in the Army. We're establishing a permanent armored forces school, and we want you to be its chief instructor. Not just for tank loaders or gunnery, but for all aspects of armored warfare. You'll have a staff, a budget, and the authority to shape how we train tank crews for the next generation." Maggie couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not even sure women will be allowed to stay in the military now that the war is over." "That's being debated in Washington," Wheeler admitted. "But I've been authorized to tell you that if you accept this position, the Army will fight to create an exception. Your expertise is too valuable to lose." She thought about it. Thought about civilian life, about the factory work she could return to, about a normal life without the military structure she'd grown accustomed to. But she also thought about the letters on her wall, the men whose lives had been changed or saved by what she'd taught them, the future soldiers who would need that same knowledge. "I accept, sir." Wheeler smiled. "Outstanding. There's one more thing. We want to recognize your contributions formally. You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. The citation will note that your training methods saved American lives and contributed materially to victory in the European theater." The medal ceremony took place 2 weeks later. Maggie stood at attention while Wheeler pinned the decoration to her uniform. Photographers captured the moment, and the next day, her picture appeared in newspapers across the country with the headline, "Woman Soldier Honored for Saving Tank Crews." The publicity brought mixed reactions. Some praised her service, others wrote angry letters to newspapers about women stepping outside their proper roles. Maggie ignored both the praise and the criticism. She had work to do. Over the following months, she assembled her staff and began developing a comprehensive training program. She brought in combat veterans like Anderson to share their experiences. She studied after-action reports from battles across Europe and the Pacific. She corresponded with British, Canadian, and even captured German tank officers to understand different approaches to armored warfare. One day in November, she received an unexpected visitor. An older man in a civilian suit appeared at her office, his face weathered but kind. "Chief Sullivan, my name is Edward Sullivan. I believe you knew my son Tommy." Maggie's breath caught. Tommy's father, her brother's father. She'd never met him. They'd been estranged for years before Tommy enlisted. "Mr. Sullivan, please come in." They talked for hours. He told her about Tommy as a boy, always taking things apart to see how they worked, always asking questions. She told him about Fort Knox, about becoming an instructor, about the letters from soldiers who had survived because of training that had been inspired, in part, by his son's sacrifice. "I wasn't there for him when he was alive," Edward said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was too proud, too stubborn, but I want you to know how proud I am of what you've done in his memory. You've saved so many families from the pain I live with every day." Before he left, he gave her a photograph. It showed Tommy in his uniform, smiling, standing next to a Sherman tank. On the back was written, "Lucky Lady and Me, North Africa, 1942. Maggie framed the photo and hung it in her office, next to all the letters. Years passed. The Cold War brought new tensions and new challenges. The Sherman was eventually replaced by more modern tanks, but the principles Maggie taught remained relevant. Know your equipment, play to its strengths, think tactically, and never let pride override common sense. She trained thousands of soldiers over the years. Some went to Korea and survived battles in terrain even worse than Europe. Some served in peacetime, never seeing combat but always ready. All of them passed through her classroom and learned from the woman who had transformed tank training. In 1960, Maggie retired from the Army after 15 years of service. She was 50 years old and had achieved the rank of major, a rare accomplishment for a woman in that era. The retirement ceremony was attended by generals, fellow instructors, and dozens of former students who had traveled from across the country to honor her. One of them was Tom Anderson, now a colonel. He gave a speech that brought tears to many eyes. "When I first met Major Sullivan, she was a specialist being mocked by men who thought they knew better. She proved them all wrong, not with words, but with knowledge, skill, and an absolute commitment to keeping soldiers alive. I,